Hey there, Banditos! Welcome to the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we are pleased as punch to welcome back J.M. DeMatteis. J.M. is a writer, you know that already. It is his third time on the program. He has upwards of 6, maybe more, new collections, reprints of his material that have come out or are coming out in the next few months. They include Moonshadow, the definitive expanded edition, his sort of fantasy, early fantasy series with Jon Muth, Dr. Fate, of course, one of his many collaborations with Keith Giffen, Spectacular Spider-Man Omnibus. Thank goodness, finally, Marvel has heard our pleas and put this series into an omnibus format, of course, working with the amazing Sal Buscema. We have Brooklyn Dreams, again, another early book, autobiographical, with Glenn Barr. And then we get into some others beyond that, including Hero Squared, again, with Giffen, and Scooby Apocalypse, which we did talk about a fair amount the last episode with JM. So let's get to it. Let's hear about all of these collections, how they came about, how the stories were formed, and what JM thinks of them. This is JM DeMatteis. JM DeMatteis. JM, how are you doing?
I am doing well. How about you?
I'm doing great. The occasion of our interview is a number of your works coming out in collected editions or expanded collected editions. You have Moonshadow, Dr. Fate, Spectacular Spider-Man, finally, Brooklyn
Yeah,
Dreams,
finally.
and there's even a fifth, which is Hero Squared, which I see is
There's
coming.
even a sixth,
Oh no!
which is a Scooby Apocalypse
Oh,
omnibus
this.
that's coming out in the fall also. It's the last project I did with Keith Giffen.
Yes, we talked about that a little bit in our
Yeah.
last interview. That's a great one, and
So there's like it's weird. I mean, it's good weird, but not bad weird, but it's weird that so much of this stuff is coming out this year.
yes, I'm going to coin the phrase the Matteisance to record this period of time.
Plus, there's a
Um,
couple of Marvel Masterworks. Someone said there's a Moon Knight collection with my Moon Knight stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff coming. But
well,
the ones you mentioned are the biggies.
it's all turning up in your honor and your name, and it's all great work. So let's dive in. Let's see if we
Okay.
can give each of them a little bit of their due. We may not go as deep because there's so many to go over, but let's start with Moonshadow, which is already out in a definitive expanded edition. Let's hit the rewind button, though, and talk about the original series, and tell us, if you could, a little bit about the genesis of that concept.
You know, Moonshadow was the first creator-owned series that I ever did. This is back in the 80s. This is when, creator-driven work was just starting to really make its way into American comics. Marvel launched the Epic Comics. DC was doing things like Ronin and Camelot 3000. There was Pacific Comics. There was just a lot of energy moving in that direction. And Moonshadow was an idea I'd had for years before that, years and years and years. But ideas take time to develop. My original version was much more of sort of a Jack Kirby, Jim Starlin cosmic space adventure thing, and it evolved into something really. Sometimes you get an opportunity with a project to take the entirety of who you are in that moment of time and pour it into a particular framework of a story, and that's what Moonshadow was for me. It was also the series that really I stepped outside of the Marvel and DC universes and just wrote it as if it was a novel. And that's what allowed me to really find my voice as a writer. Had I not done Moonshadow, I couldn't have, when Moonshadow wrapped, walked back into the Marvel universe and done Kraven's Last Hunt, because Moonshadow kind of expanded the parameters of my approach to writing a comic book. So I think it remains one of the very best things I've ever done. It remains one of my most treasured projects, not the least of which is because of my collaboration with Jon Muth. It was also the first American comic book series that was fully painted. So it's just the artwork is beautiful. Our collaboration was magical. And so we put out a hardcover through Dark Horse back in 2019, I think it was, got nominated for an Eisner. And they wanted to put out a softcover version. And we had all kinds of extras and great things. I'm not one of those people who saves a lot, but for Moonshadow, I saved almost everything because it meant so much to me. And so our editor said, well, let's shove in some more. So that's why this is the definitive edition expanded because there's even more extras in the back. It's a beautiful, beautiful collection. Dark Horse has really done right by us.
You basically answered all my questions in just that one answer, but I'm going to dive a little
Okay.
deeper, which is great. I mean, that's what we're here for. But I wanted to know specifically about the collaboration because you talked about it already with Jon Muth. And what was that partnership like when we were doing the original series? How deeply were you collaborating in terms of the what visuals you wanted and the sort of format because he was, as you said, fully painted that he
Yeah.
was doing.
We live in the same area. So it wasn't like the usual monthly book where you send in your script, it goes off to some artist who could be living anywhere, and maybe you'll talk to them, maybe you'll never meet them, maybe you'll never speak to them. So it was very intimate that way. When we started out, I thought it was going to be like what I was doing at Marvel at the time, which was write a detailed plot, give it to the artist, he'd do some pencils, I'd get it back, and I'd dialogue. But what happened with Moonshadow almost immediately was I did that, and he started to draw, and he gave me some pages. And as I started to write, the narrator, old Moonshadow, who's looking back on his life, started telling me things that weren't in the plot. you know? So it's like, can we like cut that page in half? And I need to write 5 new pages that go in the middle. And so we had to throw that version out the window. So what we used to do to a certain degree, we worked a lot of different ways. But one way that I remember very clearly, we used to meet up in a diner around where we live. I would have a breakdown of the story. We would discuss it, and John would do little layouts on napkins sometimes in the diner, because I knew even if he was doing those breakdowns, chances are once I started writing, it was going to go off and do something else that I didn't expect. And then it would go back to him and back and forth. And, so I was shaping the story, but I wasn't really shaping it because I felt like the character was shaping it. Every time I thought I knew what I was doing, he told me to do something different. And John was very flexible about that. And for certain periods of time, I would like write the copy, and I would draw little goofy layouts, knowing that John would take that and turn that into beautiful art. And I always said to him, do whatever you want, as long as you're not contradicting the copy. Feel free to play with it, because I'm not gonna hem in someone with his talent. He's one of the single most talented people I've ever worked with. And when you work with someone that good, you have to raise your game. So, I would look at his artwork and it's like, oh, well, I couldn't help but respond by responding with some of my best writing. And I think I pushed him into arenas art-wise that he wouldn't have gone to on his own. And that's the kind of collaboration you hope for, where you're challenging each other and pushing each other. So even though I was in control of the story, his visuals so fed into the tone and the feeling of it that it impacted my writing, and I think it, and vice versa. It was just a magical, wonderful collaboration.
Now, because it was fully painted,
Yeah,
was there any extra step or extra check before he started painting? I assume he drew out some
yeah, or
layouts
yeah,
and
or,
then
or at
painted.
least did layouts. Yeah, so we
Okay.
we we were we were. Although as time went by and deadlines got tighter, sometimes it was just like, hey, off he goes, and I'll see the finished art when it's finished.
Okay.
But we trusted each other.
Yeah.
We trusted each other, so it was okay in that case. It really, really was.
Now this came out, I think, originally through Marvel's Epic line. Is that right?
Yes, it was originally through Epic Comics from 1985 to 1987. Then, like 10 years later, we got the rights back, took it to Vertigo, did a sequel, Farewell Moonshadow, and then that got all collected together. So all of that's in the new edition. The original 12 issues, Farewell Moonshadow. I have an introduction. John wrote an afterword, and all kinds of extras. It's a really, like I said, it's a beautiful package.
How important was it to have that support or have that outlet, I guess, through Epic during that time? Because, before I think Epic, I mean, there were independent um, publishers, but this was something with mainstream support, but yet
Yeah.
giving creators their latitude to do their own work. What was that like? Did you feel a lot of freedom from that?
Oh, tremendous freedom, because I knew that I could basically do whatever I wanted, and they were okay with it. They were there to support me and John Muth as we followed our muse and told the story that we wanted to do. And we had people like, Archie Goodwin and Margaret Clark and Laurie Sutton and Dan Chichester working over at Epic, all really, really, really good people. And we were very, very supported. Yeah, yeah. That was the whole point of Epic, was to like say, okay, go.
Yeah.
But
And
that was the
now,
whole feeling in the 80s. I got to tell you, just across the board, even on the mainstream books, when we get to Dr. Fate, I will address that. There was a lot of freedom to take these stories and these characters and to push the boundaries and do things that we didn't have the freedom to do before. It was great.
well, that's probably a good segue, because I was going to bring up Dr. Fate next, but maybe just following up on that answer, what was it about the 80s? I mean, how did that occur, that we went from the 70s that maybe was a little bit more conservative in terms of just putting out the superhero output to much more experimentation in the 80s? Was it just an editorial shift in terms of generationally?
It's interesting when I think about it because there were a lot of great, unique comics in the 70s. The mainstream superheroes were still done in a mainstream way, but you had people like Steve Gerber, on virtually everything that he wrote, pushing
Yeah.
boundaries, Man-Thing and Defenders and Howard the Duck, which were, in some way they felt like creator-owned books under the Marvel banner. Weenan writes it on Swamp Thing. There was a lot of really interesting work, Tomb of Dracula, that had they been done in the 80s, could have been creator-owned books. So the seeds were all there. I think it all just, the seeds were there and it all sort of came up out of the ground in the 80s. And part of it was because these independents were cropping up, were giving creators their rights, we're paying, we're paying royalties, all these things that then started to seep into the mainstream. And so now you were getting support. So, working at Epic, we were we got to hold on to our rights, but we also were paid a decent page rate. That was an amazing thing to be able to work on a creator generated work, an original work like that, to be able to make a decent amount of money and still maintain rights. It was and I think that spirit just kind of spread throughout the industry. It was just, now things are not that people still, there's lots of places to go and do creator owned work now, not to really make any money doing it unless you sell it on the back end to movies or something. But there are plenty of avenues for that. Then there really weren't. But then you could do it. Same thing with Vertigo. Vertigo paid us very fair rates, and that was a great thing. But now in terms of the mainstream superhero stuff, my experience is a lot of it is much more top down. Well, we want to do this, we want to do that, or we want to do this. What do you think you can do with this kind of thing? As
Right.
opposed to, here's what I'm going to do. Here's this story about Spider-Man and Kraven and Vermin, and then, oh, sure, go ahead, do it. Oh, that's
Yeah.
really weird, but it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it would be nice to have a little bit more of that 80s experimental spirit in the mainstream comics. But as you say, we do have so many more avenues. The
Yes.
bar for entry has been lowered, and you're seeing, so much for so many different people. So that's,
Yeah,
yin and yang there. Um,
exactly. Exactly.
so wanted to move to Dr. Fate. Again, this is a collection that is out now. It's not a
Yeah.
future one. When you were brought on this book, actually, I'd like to hear again the genesis of this, but you were bringing a human element, I think, to a very magical, maybe cosmic character. So what drew you to this mystical side of DC and introducing this sort of new uh, format of Dr. Fate, this new personalities to Dr. Fate, which
Right. It
were
was a whole
Eric and
new,
Linda
basically,
Strauss.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right, I'll get that. So, I've always liked the supernatural characters, the mystical characters, because it allows you to dig into areas of metaphysics, of ideas that you don't necessarily get to explore in a superhero book. So I've always liked those characters, supernatural, metaphysical, that whole arena, mystical. I love Doctor Strange at Marvel. And really, I was drawn to Doctor Fate because, well, I was at DC and it wasn't Doctor Strange. So, how is another doctor who's a magician? In the beginning, I didn't know that much about Doctor Fate. And in the end, I didn't have to because I recreated the whole thing. So, I had been at Marvel for a number of years. I went back to DC, and this was one of the first things I pitched. My memory is that it was a long process. For some reason, I'd pitch it. They go, oh, well, what about it? And I'd go back and I'd rewrite something, and went on for months. And then finally, they gave us a go ahead for a miniseries. And even though it came out, I think after JLI came out, I think we started working on it before. So I think it was the first time I really met Keith Giffen was when we started working on Dr. Fate, if my memory is correct after all these years. But I remember going out to lunch with Keith, and Denny O'Neil was the editor, And I thought I had the story all worked out. And here I am with Danny O'Neill and Keith Giffen, and ideas are just flying everywhere. You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, we could do this, and we could do that, and we could do this. And I distinctly remember going home, going, great, here's a whole lot of ideas that don't add up to a story. And I had to take all this stuff and, throw stuff out and keep stuff and shape that into a story. So the first four-issue miniseries that we did introduced Eric and Linda, introduced Naboo in Kent Williams. Kent Williams. Kent Williams is an artist friend of mine. Kent Nelson's body. Uh, Although Kent Williams did do the cover for the Dr. Fate annual, so there you go.
There you go.
And it was a very dark, intense miniseries introducing this new version of the character. We finished it. We were done. And then what happened, I think maybe a year and a half, maybe even 2 years went by. We were doing JLI, which was going gangbusters. Dr. Fate was in JLI, and I thought, oh, Dr. Fate, I'd like to go back to that character. I pitched it to them. They said, sure, go ahead. Karen Berger, who had not yet started Vertigo, was the editor for the first 6 issues. Then Art Young took over. And what's interesting is when we started out, the approach was going to be sort of a JLI approach to Dr. Fate. So if you look at the first issue, there's a lot of humor in it. There's a lot of lightness. But what happened was just kind of what I talked about before, when you get this framework to tell a story that represents everything that you are in that moment in space and time. So as the story started to unfold, well, yeah, it was comedy, but it was deeply serious. It was philosophical. It dealt with religion. It had lowbrow humor. It was a superhero book. It was a supernatural. It was everything, It was everything that interested me got poured into that book. And the wonderful thing was we did the 4-issue miniseries, then 24 issues plus an annual of an ongoing series that told a complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an actual end. And they let us end it. Eric and Linda's story was over by issue 24. And when the new writer came in with the next issue, it was the return of Kent Nelson and Inza Nelson as Dr. Fate. So, I mean, that never happens. It's to get permission to take an established DC character and completely tear it apart, put it back together, and do whatever you want. Now, clearly, if it was Superman or Batman, I couldn't have done it. But still, I don't think you could do that with those characters now to push it as far as we pushed it back then. And then to finish the story, this is serialized storytelling. You can't have a definitive ending. It's got to go on forever.
Right.
So that was really a blessing too. So it was again an amazing creative experience. So on the ongoing series, I worked with Sean McManus, who became very quickly one of my all-time favorite collaborators. Just a wonderful artist. He's working with me on my DeMatteis Kickstarter line of books. He's just fantastic. Anything I asked Sean to do, he gave me what I wanted or something better. And it was just a great experience working on that book.
Did you have any pushback from DC when you said I want the Dr. Fate character to be new people?
No. But the other thing that was going on at DC in the 80s was they were reinventing a lot of stuff. It was Man of Steel. They relaunched Wonder Woman with Perez. There was, our new Justice League. There was the push was on, I think, again, that's that 80s mentality. Let's bring in some fresh air here. Let's try to revamp and reimagine these characters in this world.
So what was your approach on Dr. Fate to balance the mystical, the magical, elements, the supernatural elements,
along with the stupid and the silly,
and the silly and the stupid and the sort of character building, moments to make it more, human or grounded.
But that's just it. I think you just hit on it. It's all rooted in character. It doesn't matter where the story is going to take you, as long as you ground those characters and they feel real. All right, we're going down the supernatural road. Oh, we're going down the comparative religion road. Oh, we're going down the vaudeville road. Whatever it is, as long as those characters remain real and grounded, you can go anywhere, and hopefully the audience will follow you. What's interesting is when the book came out, I knew we had an audience, but it never felt like a huge audience. And the response to the collection that I saw online on social media, so many people that read and loved that book or heard about it and are dying to read it now. It's very gratifying after all these years to know that there's actually an audience for this series that I, again, like Moonshadow, consider one of the best things I've ever done. One of the oddest things I've ever done, but one of the best.
And do you have after working on this, and putting it all together, 24 issues plus the mini series and annual. Do you have a soft spot for this character who often gets, I feel like, overshadowed quite a
Oh, I
bit by
absolutely do.
its cousin, his
I
cousin?
absolutely do. In fact, when the new edition came out and McFarlane Toys put out a new Dr. Fate figure, and I had to buy it immediately, and it's sitting on my shelf right in front of the books, you know? So yes, yeah, I have a soft spot for our version of Dr. Fate. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And my take on Naboo and that whole world that we created. But it's, again, I have a soft spot for the supernatural characters in general. And DC has such a deep bench of wonderful supernatural characters. I wrote Justice League Dark for I know a year and a half, 2 years. And it was so much fun because you could pull in, oh, Swamp Thing, okay, okay, oh, I Vampire, okay. Any weird supernatural character, Phantom Stranger, whatever you needed, it was there. And they have great ones.
Yes, for sure. You mentioned Keith Giffen.
Yeah.
Maybe your first or one of your first collaborations with him on the miniseries.
Yeah.
What was that like, and was there any indication of what was to come? Because he eventually went on to be sort of a writer artist along with you.
Right.
Were you working more traditionally with you in the writer role and him in the artist role?
I was, I have to say also, I think there were so many delays with that book that even though we started working on it before JLI, probably it came out after JLI came out, which just meant we were probably working on it simultaneously with JLI. But here's the thing with Keith. Keith is very Kirby-like. So, I'll write a detailed plot and give it to Keith. And if he decides to like go off in some other dimension for a couple of pages, or just, or his visual inventiveness, the way I may give him a certain sequence, but the way he chooses to tell that sequence is unlike anybody else. And some artists, if they do that, you want to strangle them because, they end up upending your story. But Keith has such a fine sense of story that nothing he did upended anything that I did. It just deepened, and it kind of like the same seeds as when we worked together as writers. It was all about surprising each other. I'd get his plot, and I can't believe he just did that. Well, guess what I'm going to do in the dialogue and surprise him. And that's what our relationship was like all those years working together, writing together. So it was great. There's, in the Dr. Fate thing, when Naboo is in Kent Nelson's body, one of the greatest visuals, suddenly Naboo is talking through a mouth in Kent's, I forget whether it's chest or belly. Now, that wasn't in the plot. Keith just decided that was going to be in there, so he stuck a mouth on him. So it was always great to work with Keith. Always, always, always. But little did we know that was the beginning of a collaboration that was going to go on for more than 30 years.
Right. Sometimes you don't know these things
No,
that
you
you look
can't.
back
How
on
could
them
you
and it's like a
possibly know
big,
that,
yeah,
Yeah.
a big fork in the road. Let's move on to another big collaboration artistically and with your writing, which was Spectacular Spider-Man. I don't believe so. First of all, I think we've covered, you've probably talked about it at length, how long it's taken for this to see the light of day as a published
Yeah.
collection.
There've been some individual stories over the years that have been reprinted, but the whole run has never been done.
And we still don't know the mystery behind that or why they finally have
I don't know. I'm just
chosen to put it
happy.
out now. Yes,
Uh, when
I'm
when,
happy as well.
when one of my editors at Marvel called me up, who I've been like badgering about this, they're doing it. I was just so happy, and I'm happy for Sal too, because Sal's he might be 89 or 90 now. Let's get the book out. Let's get this into Sal's hands. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Let
for
him enjoy
sure.
this.
For sure. I was going
Yeah.
to bring up that collaboration and ask you. Well, first of all, the omnibus is not out yet.
July, next month. I'm not sure
Next
the
month
exact date, but it's coming out in July.
in July. Okay. So, yeah, tell me a little bit about how you got on the book, whether you and how you got paired up with Sal to begin with.
Well, my memory is I got on the book because they said, "Hey, you want to write Spectacular Spider-Man?" I said, "Sure." It was very, very, very long story, and that was the entire story. And my memory is they said, "Well, we have two artists available. It's either Sal Buscema or artist X, whose name I will not mention, obviously." And I went, "Sal." When I was a fan, Sal was one of those guys. Some people when they come in, you see an artist or a writer for the first time, and you go, these guys, they have a way to go. You know what I mean? But Sal, I remember the first time I saw his art. Well, he originally was inking, I think, his brother on Silver Surfer, but I remember the first time seeing his own penciling was, I think, on Avengers, when I was, a hardcore fan reading Avengers every month. And this guy is so good, and he was great right out of the box. And we had worked together. When I say together, he'd done when I was writing Marvel Team Up, he'd pitched in to do some fill-ins on a few issues. Same thing when I was writing Captain America, but we had no interactions or anything. He was just, we need someone to fill in on this issue, and Sal came in and did breakdowns, and that was that. But if you ever saw Sal's breakdowns, every line is just exactly in the right place, doing the right thing. He is such a consummate storyteller. So I said, yeah, I'll work with Sal. Let's have Sal. And it was one of those magical things. And I've said this many times over the years, but I have to repeat it because it's true. Virtually from the first page, the first panel, something clicked between us. It just did. You can't make that happen. It either happens or same as chemistry between people. You can't say, I want to be that person's friend and I'm going to create chemistry with them. It doesn't work that way. It's either there or it's not. And with Sal, it just happened immediately. There was something in my plots, and my plots are very detailed, that Sal responded to. And then I looked at his artwork because that's the way we work, detailed plots. I get the artwork, then I'd script from that. Um, and I remember, I have a memory of getting the first pages, and it was just like, oh. And it was so easy to write from that. That's the beauty of working Marvel style, because you're responding when you're working with someone like a Sal, who's a really great storyteller. You're just responding to the artwork. That thing you thought you were going to have to say on this page, turns out you don't have to say it at all. Or, you don't have to over describe things because it's all there in the action. Or we'll get to like with Spectacular Spider-Man 200. I've told this story many times. We get to the end with the death of Harry Osborn, and I was prepared to like get out the ladle and ladle on the schmaltz, you know what I mean? And tug on the heartstrings and do all that stuff. And I got to the last 3 pages, and everything I asked Sal to do in that plot, every emotion that I described, and I get very deeply into that stuff when I write, it was there on the page. And I actually started to write something and went, threw it out and just let those pages speak for themselves, and that's the way it was with Sal. The icing on the cake was incredibly nice human being, a pleasure to work with, a total professional. Loved getting on the phone and talking to him. I mean, just a wonderful person and one of the best artists to ever work at Marvel, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, for sure. And I fell in love with his artwork on that series. And it was only later that someone said that it was actually a little bit of a style departure for him on that series compared to what had been before. And I don't know if you noticed that. I mean, if it was, I loved it. But did you notice anything while you were working that he was working in slightly different
Well, I
style?
think, what I think was going on with Sal was for a lot of years, they knew how fast and dependable he was. So, Sal, we need to fill in here. We need 3 issues of this. We need that. Need to do breakdowns, and someone else would ink it. And you didn't get the full Sal.
Right.
But here he was inking himself, which I think he had been before I came on the book. And then I think he was very inspired by the stories. He really, really loved those stories.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a three-parter with the Vulture, and he had a little extra time. And I remember getting those first inked pages, and his inking kind of took a different turn also. I don't know if this is before or after he was working with Walt Simonson on Thor also, which is where he took another big leap. So, and that's what I respect about artists like Sal as well. He'd been in the business for years at that point, but he was still
Still
challenging himself.
evolving.
He was still
Yep.
growing. So just one of the best, one of the
Yeah.
very, very best.
Absolutely.
And I consider those stories in terms of my mainstream superhero work to be among the very, very best things I've ever done in superhero world.
For sure. Had me and many others engrossed in that entire storyline. Coming into the book, what did you have? How much did you have, I guess, in terms of where you wanted to take the story, what you wanted to do with Spider-Man, Peter Parker as characters, and how much did you discover while writing?
I had this germ of a story, which I'd actually been trying to work as a Batman story at DC, and something happened. I wasn't able to do it. But I was really, into getting deep into, well, the first storyline is called The Child Within. How our childhoods and how our trauma from our childhoods impact us and shape us. And that was the thread that I really wanted to explore in that story. And then there was Peter and Harry. And here's what's funny about memory. My memory was that Kurt Busiek had done some fill-in issues and that he had some little scene in there with Norman Osborn's voice, haunting Harry from off panel. And that sparked my idea. But Kurt has said, we discussed this on social media once, no, I was going to do that. And my editor, Danny Fingeroth, said, could you seed this in? So my memory is completely incorrect. I thought I saw something in one of Kurt's stories, but it turns out that Kurt put it in the story because I was doing it in the upcoming storyline. So we can never completely trust our memory. So anything I tell you today, take with a grain of salt. This is the best way I remember it. But Peter and Harry, Jerry Conway had done that stuff some years before with Harry as the Green Goblin. And I was fascinated with this idea because, emotionally and psychologically, the stories pretty much write themselves of two best friends who love each other, and yet they are enemies. I mean, you can't get more dramatic than that. So I had that to pull me through, and then this whole exploration of the child within, getting into uh, Peter, and I had never seen it really explored. What impact did it have on this little boy that both, we know what Uncle Ben did, but what about when both his parents died when he was what, 3 or 4 years old, and what really is the toll on Harry of being raised by a lunatic like Norman Osborn? And then there was the Vermin character, which Mike Zeck and I had introduced in Captain America and in Kraven's Last Hunt. And so I had never taken a deep dive into him and who he was and his background. So I took all these three characters and their traumatic childhoods and played them off against each other within the context of a big slam bang superhero story. Also introduced the character of Dr. Kafka, because every superhero needs a good therapist, right?
I think so. I think
I think they need him more than the rest of us, to be
they
perfectly honest.
probably
Yeah.
do. I always like that element in Incredible Hulk. Doc Samson
Right,
played
right,
for Bruce Banner.
right.
So I thought that's always interesting. And it also, because you were very much interested in the psychological,
Yes.
motivations and
Always,
interactions with these
always.
characters. And that is a good way to kind of get those out without it being sort of forced.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
So it was, that first Child Within. If I was going to pick one arc out of that whole run, certainly I'd pick that story. If I was going
oh,
to
for sure.
pick a single issue, it would be Spec 200 with the death of Harry. But we also had some fun. Like when Child Within was over, I brought in the Frogman, Fabulous Frogman,
Yeah.
because we needed to lighten things up a little bit after 7 issues of intensely heavy stuff.
Yeah.
The Vulture story, I really loved that. I mean, the whole run was just, again, was a pleasure.
I may know the answer to this question based on what you just said, but you worked on this book during the early 90s. Things are starting to cross over with more and more frequency. There are line-wide crossovers. Did you have a lot of editorial, I don't want to call it interference, but requests, maybe even demands in terms of those crossovers for that book that
Well, for
interfered with
that
where you were
book,
taking?
we didn't do any, if I remember. I think the only no, and it didn't enter, not until we got to Maximum Carnage at the very, very end. So for the 2 years that Sal and I worked on that book before Maximum Carnage, again, I was given so much freedom. Danny Fingeroth was the editor for most of it. Then Rob Tokar, who worked for Danny, took over after that. And Danny trusted me. Danny's the kind of editor that goes over everything with a fine-tooth comb, but in the end, he always trusted me. And I also knew when you work with an editor that trusts you like that, when they pipe up and say, but well, that's not working over there. If they leave you alone for 6 issues and come in and tell you what's not working in the seventh issue, you better pay attention. And that was the way it worked with Danny. If he brought something up, I paid attention and I fixed it. But he gave me so much freedom to tell those stories exactly the way I wanted to tell them. And not everybody had that freedom back then.
Yeah, absolutely. What did Sal ever come to you with ideas or requests in terms of like, I'd love to draw this, or I've been dying to draw this
You
villain
know,
or characters or anything?
No, I don't think it ever came up. He just took the stories and, knocked him out of the park month after month. He's a pro. Whatever you give him, he's going to give you the best version of that.
Green, Go- Green Goblin. We talked about you talked about a little bit already. How much So The Child Within was one of the first series, and then culminating in his story where Harry dies in 200. Um, Again, how much was that planned out? And did you know coming into the book that you wanted Green Goblin to be kind of the overarching villain?
I didn't know it was going to, it's that's the fun of it. You know, you reach a certain point where the characters take over, the story has a life of its own. I knew I wanted to do that initial Child Within story. I didn't know that was going to be a story that was going to weave in and out for 2 years and climax with the death of Harry Osborn. I'm not the kind of writer that walks in on day one and goes, and 2 years from now, this is all going to lead to the moment when Harry, it doesn't work that way for me. So I just kind of followed the character, followed the stories, and Harry just kept coming back, you know. And I realized that at a certain point there had to be a climax. And in the climax, as you're writing, go, oh shit, Harry's going to die. Okay, that wasn't part of the plan, but here we go, you know. And that's the fun of it for me. Well, I know if the story surprises me, I hope it will surprise the readers.
Right.
Because if I don't know what's coming, then they certainly don't know what's coming.
Okay, we're gonna shift now, do a 180 to Brooklyn Dreams. So we're going from
Okay.
big superhero action to very introspective, maybe mostly
Yeah,
autobiographical.
yeah, mostly autobiographical with a thin veneer on top to protect the innocent. I basically changed the names to protect the innocent. Everything in the book is true, though,
There
as
you
I
go.
remember it, you know? Yeah, Brooklyn, you know, what's fun about this conversation is all of these things we've talked about are among my apps. If I was making my top 10 of all the projects I ever worked on, these would all be there, you know?
That's great.
Um, so Brooklyn Dreams, really, the seeds of Brooklyn Dreams were in Moonshadow, because in Moonshadow, for those that haven't read it, you know, his mother was brought up in Brooklyn. She, in a slightly different generation than me, but I used to do these flashbacks because they were living in an intergalactic zoo. So, but we used to do these flashbacks to her Brooklyn childhood, things that happened to her growing up, and setting up seeds and themes that then would continue into the bigger cosmic story of Moonshadow. And I thought at one point, gee, it would really be fun to just do a story about growing up in Brooklyn, about what it was to be crazy and dysfunctional growing up in the 60s and the 70s in Brooklyn. And I think I pitched it to Epic at one point while I was working on Moonshadow. And whatever the reason was, it just didn't work out. And I couldn't, it's been so long, I don't know why it didn't work out. Whether I decided I was going to wait, whether they said, oh, maybe it's not the time to do this, let's wait till Moonshadow's over. And by the time it was over, we were all on to something else. I couldn't tell you. But I had the idea. And then, you know, time went by, and DC had started a new imprint called Piranha Press. A guy named Mark Neville was the editor. Um, and Piranha Press eventually mutated into Paradox Press, but it started as Piranha Press. And they were doing, you know, offbeat, you know, personal, creator-owned kind of material. And so I pitched it there. And again, it was one of those things where it took a long time to get approval, and things just, were we ever going to do this project? And then finally it would get approved. And then I was involved with it. It just took time. But the wonderful, magical thing that happened, and you know, I've been praising every single artist I've worked with to the sky. It's not true of every artist I've ever worked with, but these guys are amazing, every single artist I'm talking about. So I'm in Mark Neville's office, and I have images in my head of what I want this book to look like. You know, Will Eisner was a big inspiration. When you read his something like Contract with God, oh, if I can do that, if he can do that, then I can do this story, because he's kind of cleared the path for people to follow and tell these kind of personal, grounded, real life stories. Harvey Pekar too, in a very weird way, with American Splendor, you know,
Sure.
cleared ground there too. I loved American Splendor. He was a very, very interesting, unique talent. So, but I had images in my head of what this would look like. And it was sort of like I guess when I think about it, Eisner, if Eisner was a young guy drawing comics in the 90s, I don't know, you know? And so I had, but very specific images in my head. Mark Neville opens up this drawer and pulls out some samples from Glenn Barr. And honest to God, it was like, that's the pictures I've been seeing in my head. This is exactly the style. How often does that happen? You know?
Can't imagine often.
Not very often, maybe, you know, once or twice, you know. And so Glenn and I, same thing. And Glenn and I, you know, we've talked over the years. I think we met face to face once all these years, but you don't need to meet for that chemistry to happen. Do you know what I mean? The chemistry is on the page.
Right.
And the same thing happened. I wrote these scripts, and anything I asked for, Glenn either met the challenge or transcended the challenge. And one of the biggest compliments I ever got was from a writer that I know who said, I always thought that the greatest comics are the ones that are done by one person who's writing and drawing and doing the whole thing. But I read Brooklyn Dreams, and you guys basically did a mind meld. It was as if it was coming out of one creative center. And that's a great compliment. Because it was my life, but he was bringing it to life. And it was just, it couldn't have worked out any better. I go up if someone says, what's your favorite thing that you've ever done? And I go, Moonshadow. No, 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 it's Brooklyn Dreams. Maybe Moonshadow. There's like three, maybe sometimes four things. But I think if I was forced to pick, I couldn't. It would either be probably either Moonshadow or Brooklyn Dreams, and I think because nah, I can't say one or the other. But that's how much that project means to me, and that's how happy I was with it because again, to get to work with these artists, comics, I don't care if I'm the most brilliant writer that ever lived. If I'm not paired with the right artist, the story's going to die. It's comics. It's a fusion of words and pictures, and in fact, everything matters in comics. The lettering, the coloring, everything contributes to making that book what it is. Brooklyn James was black and white, so Glenn worked in tone. But Bob Lappin did the lettering, wonderful, wonderful letterer who lettered all our JLI stuff. And again, we'd gone from Piranha Press to Paradox Press. Andy Helfer was running, who was our JLI editor, was running Paradox Press. And Margaret Clark, who had worked on Moonshadow, was the editor overseeing Brooklyn Dreams. So it was sort of like old home week there, too. So it was a very comfortable atmosphere where I was allowed to do my story exactly the way I wanted to tell it. And Glenn was allowed to interpret it the way he wanted to interpret it. And so it originally came out in like 4 digest size books. And then some years later, Vertigo collected it. And now this will then IDW maybe 8, 9 years ago or more did a hardcover collection. But now we're at Dark Horse with a hardcover, kind of doing what we did with Moonshadow. We've got extras in the back. I wrote an introduction. It's going to Dark Horse. I'm working with an editor there, Philip Simon, who is just the best. And he wrote a thesis in college on Moonshadow. So he was so dedicated to making sure that the Moonshadow book came out right. And he's putting the same love and attention on Brooklyn Dream. So it's going to be a beautiful edition when it comes out, I think in September.
Very much looking forward to it.
Yeah.
With the major exception of American Splendor and Harvey Pekar using, a series of artists, sometimes more than once. You're right that a lot of these black and white autobio comics are traditionally sort of writer artists. And so it's, again, with that big exception, it's interesting to hear about how you and your artist came together, again, without physically coming together and, talking, to just, put together something that is so personal and so introspective, but yet from two people, not from, well, more than two people, of
Right.
course,
Right.
but not
Right.
not just one. So that's fascinating to hear. I'd love to know if you had done any kind of autobio comics or writing before that, and if not, how did you approach doing this project, which is, these are kind of different. It's definitely a different genre than
Yeah.
superheroes or sci-fi or anything else.
Well, Moonshadow was autobiography filtered through fantasy. You know what I mean? I'm going to tell the story of my life, but I'm going to filter it through this wild, fantastic fairy tale for grown-ups. And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter what you're writing on some degree. When I'm writing Spider-Man, it's autobiographical in some way. The audience doesn't know that, but I'm pouring my life through that. But there's something very, very different when it's that naked as it is with something like Brooklyn Dreams. But it was simultaneously the easiest and most difficult thing I ever wrote. It was the easiest because these were stories about my life that I had told friends over the years. So you know what I mean? It was like, and the approach to the storytelling in Brooklyn Dreams was, sit down, I'm going to tell you a story. Like it was 3 o'clock in the morning and you're sitting with a friend. You want to hear what happened to me when I was 15? And then halfway through the story, it reminds you of something that happened to you when you were 8. You jump back to that, you jump forward. And that was so the storytelling was really, really natural for me. It was really, really easy for me, except it was so personal that it was scary. Like, am I really going to put this out there? I felt like I was, on the one hand, I'm telling this story like I would to my friends on 3 o'clock in the morning. On the other hand, I'm doing it walking on a tightrope because you're exposing yourself in a way that you're not when you're filtering it through other characters and other situations and other worlds. So that was the challenge with Brooklyn Dreams, was to kind of take a deep breath and get comfortable walking on that tightrope while I was telling these stories that I had told many times before.
Now, if you didn't have Piranha Press, was this something you would be determined to get out no matter what?
You know, I since those options were there, I can't answer that question. It was
Yeah,
like I think by the time Paradox and Piranha were around, I think Epic had really changed, and I don't think there would have been an avenue for that at Epic. So, but the door was there and the door was open. So I never thought about, well, where am I going to go if I don't go here? Because that door was open. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one.
makes sense. I'm just it's interesting, like again, comparing it to Moonshadow, where you had these opportunities that I won't say may have only existed then, but I think sort of were cropping up more then with Epic and Piranha to do these kind of works, and it just it's great that you had them, and
And the other
is
thing is, as creators, we have to take advantage of that. You know what I
true.
mean? You
Yeah,
you have to make the opportunities. No one came to me and said, "Do you want to do an autobiographical comic?" No one came to me and said, "Do you want to do your first creator-owned book and find your voice as a writer?" That was out of a desire in me. So it was my desire to grow and expand as a writer, combined with the fact that, as you say, it was a great time for those opportunities because you could find places to take those ideas and get them out into the world. But if you don't challenge yourself, it's never going to happen. I could have just continued to write superheroes for years and never done anything different.
yeah.
But there was something in me that was not content doing that. And so for all those years since Moonshadow, I've always had creator-owned stuff going on and working on mainstream stuff and, working on prose and working on TV because you just have to keep doing different things and challenging yourself.
One more question around Moonshadow and Brooklyn Dreams, both,
Okay.
very personal work. Um, and that is when you're writing and you're thinking about, these independent personal stories, is there a something in your mind where you're trying to figure out what might be resonant with other people? Or are you really just saying, this is a story I want to tell, and if I tell it to my best ability, um, it will resonate because I am telling, a very personal, good story?
That's exactly what it is. You can't, especially in a story that's that personal, you can't tailor it to an audience. And even with mainstream stuff, by the time you're tailoring something to an audience based on what you think the audience wants at that moment, probably by the time your story comes out, the audience is on to something else anyway. I've never been a big fan of tailor it to the audience. An editor
Hmm.
might say, use this character because they're selling well right now, and you do that because that's what they asked of you. But left to my own devices, I can't tailor a story to someone else's expectations because who the hell knows what their expectations are, and those expectations will change. And then if it's a personal story, all you can do is just what you said. That's all I can do with any story. Write it to the best of my ability. Once I'm done, I always say I sail it out into the world, and it's between the story and the audience. It's out of my hands. I can't do anything about it. It might be a story that I think is the greatest thing I've ever written, and they go, yeah, and they walk away. And maybe 10 years later, someone comes up and says, I really love that story. And sometimes it's a story I think, well, that's a pretty good story, not the best thing I ever wrote, and it becomes the classic that everybody wants to read for 30 years. You don't know. So all I can do is the best that I can do, sail it out there and leave it to the audience to figure the rest of it out.
Makes sense. I think that's a good approach. We have gone through the four originals
Okay.
that I wanted to talk about, but now you've introduced a couple others. Well, your
Oh, Hero
publishers have
Squared is an
introduced a
original
couple squares.
also. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Hero Squared is now coming out in a collection in October, I
I think
believe.
it's October because it's Boom's 20th anniversary. So they're doing a select group of books in these new editions. Hero Squared is the first and only creator-owned thing that Keith Giffen and I ever did. And it is probably my favorite thing that Keith and I ever did. So if anyone's a JLI fan, please pick this up because this was a really special one for the both of us. And what's interesting is that Keith came to me with the basic idea of the series And it was very similar. I don't know if he and I ever even discussed it, to an idea that I'd been working on my own a few years before. So I really resonated with the idea. And it's sort of the ultimate Giffen DeMatteis story. It's the premise is, for those that don't know, there's a whole group of superheroes in this other, we'll say it's another dimension. The main character is Captain Valor, who's the kind of Superman, Captain Marvel, perfect ultra superhero, having this battle with this villain Caligulus, which destroys their entire universe. And he ends up being thrown into another dimension, and he lands basically in our world, where he looks. It will be as if Superman landed in this world and goes looking for Clark Kent. Except Clark Kent is like a 21-year-old slacker who has no superpowers because there are no superheroes in this world, and Caligulus is coming. So the two of them have to figure this out. And then on top of all that, Milo has a girlfriend, Steffi, who in the other universe is the villain, Caligulus. So it's a buddy comedy, it's a romance, it's a superhero story. It's all these things that Keith and I love to play with, all colliding together. I think it manages to be both very, very funny, and yet the characters are very, very real. And I just loved working on it. So we started with a one shot, then we did a mini series, then we did like 8 issues of an ongoing series, then we did another mini series again, we concluded the story. We got to finish the story and end it. And the other fun thing that happened was, in the context of working on the book, I would throw in all these references to all these other characters from Captain Valor's universe, this hero and that hero, and oh yeah, remember the Maw Visitor, and remember Captain so and so, and all that. So we did two miniseries with what we called the Planetary Brigade, which was the Justice League of this universe. All these characters that I had just mentioned in dialogue, suddenly we got to create and put on the page. So the omnibus has the whole run of Hero Squared, beginning, middle, and end, as well as all our Planetary Brigade stories. I wrote a new introduction, a kind of a tribute to Keith, who, as most of you know, passed away not that long ago. And it's another great package and another series that, I'll say it again, one of my favorite things I've ever done. And I have to give credit where credit's due. Most of the art, not all of it, most of it was done by a guy named Joe Abraham, who left comics, unfortunately, because he was like one of the most talented newcomers ever. He was able to do the kind of thing that Kevin Maguire does, where, really, really get the characters acting. He could do the big action. He's a very, very talented guy. And we had a number of other artists that worked with us along the way as well. But Joe was the main artist on Hero Squared.
Well, looking forward to that one for sure. It's always good to have more of you and Keith in the world. And of course, there's also, you mentioned Scooby-Doo Apocalypse.
Yeah,
Your last collaboration, we went into more detail there. So I will leave that for when it is. We'll put it in the show notes, but I will leave that for when it's coming out. Did you say November, maybe?
I think, no, I think that's also coming out in September as well. I
Oh,
think.
okay.
Don't quote me, but somewhere around there, somewhere in the fall. I think it may be September. I didn't. A lot of times I don't know about these things till I read them in the solicits.
Yeah,
Unless
for
they ask
sure.
me to write an introduction, I don't know. And I went,
Yeah, there it
Scooby
is.
Omnibus, really?
Right.
Wow, that's great. And one of the reasons why I think it's great again is because it was the last thing that Keith and I worked on together. So that means something to me.
Yeah.
And it was one of those gigs which we may have talked about in the past, when Keith called me up and said, they want us to do this. And I was like, what?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
What? And it turned into such a fun gig that we both loved working on. And we had a lot of great artists that worked on it with us. To me, to sit here and say, oh yeah, I worked on Scooby Apocalypse, one of the best gigs ever. I'm still shocked that I can say that sentence. But it really turned out that way. We had a lot of fun with that series.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up last time. I mean, it just sticks out like a blaring sign on the highway
Right,
from your
right.
bibliography. And I was like, I gotta ask about this. It's just so interesting and askew, I think,
Well, I used
from
to say to Keith, and I probably said this to you before, I would work with Keith on anything. If Keith had called me up and said, "Hey, we're going to do a 12-issue Millie the Model maxi series," I'd say I'm in,
yeah,
because I loved working with him so much. I would have done anything with him.
right, right. Well, having all this work out there,
Mhm.
and maybe I don't know if you've done this, but sort of taking stock of some of the, your what you describe as your most favorite work out there. Do you see in these different projects kind of any kind of evolution or change in how you did things, the kind of projects you did, how, your collaborators, anything like that? Or do you really see them as just very separate projects
No,
along a
no,
continuum?
I think they're all of a piece in some way. I mean, the stuff I do with Keith almost exists in its own universe. You know, we kind of took his strengths and my strengths and put our brains together and created this third person, and it's a very unique thing that brought out elements in each other that aren't necessarily there when we worked individually. So that's its own universe. In terms of the other work that's primarily mine, I kind of see it as a continuum. I'm always hoping to expand and change and deepen as a writer, find better ways to express myself, find new storytelling doors to open. But what's interesting to me are the themes. There are recurring themes through all my work, and I think what happens over the years, and it's right through to the DeMatteis, the stuff that I've been doing on Kickstarter. Our backers really just last month, all the books were printed and sent out, so everybody's got them, and I'm very excited. Um, but you hope that as you continue to explore these themes, because there are certain themes that obsess all of us. For me, it's personal identity. Who am I? Why am I here? Whether it's on the psychological level or on the cosmic spiritual level, um, family units, dysfunctional families, working things out, parents and children, all of that stuff. These are all themes. In the beginning, I didn't know those were the themes because I was just writing. And then you look back and go, oh, I've always been writing about this stuff, always. And you hope that the themes deepen and expand and you can approach them and express them in clearer ways and better ways and deeper ways as the years go by. That's one of the reasons I hope DC gets around to collecting my run on the Spectre that I did in the early 2000s, because I always thought that was sort of the spiritual successor to Dr. Fate, taking the place where I was where that jumped off and then moving forward and expanding and exploring those ideas in new ways. But I think that's what all of this work is, right up to the demultiverse, right up to the prose work I've been doing the past few years. There are these things that we're always trying to work out in our lives, and you're looking for new ways to you're always looking. I always say you got to get the flashlight out, and whether it's picking up the top of the characters' heads or going into new corners of the universe, looking for the answers to these questions and new ways to express those answers and the questions too.
Yeah. Well, James, I think that is a good place to leave it. It's
Okay.
just fabulous that you have so many great collections coming out right now. What does it
I will.
mean?
Can I plug some of
I
the
was
current
going,
stuff
that
now?
was my next
Okay.
question.
Good.
Go ahead.
Okay.
What do you
Great.
got going on right now besides seeing all of these works
Right, right,
coming
right.
out?
September is a new Spider-Man miniseries, Spider-Man 94, which is a callback to the animated series from the 90s. This will be like the next season of that animated series. That will be out. We just completed the Demultiverse chapter 2, and we're going to move on to chapter 3. Looking forward to continuing all 4 of those books. Um, let's see. I have an episode of Cape Crusader, the Amazon Batman series that'll be on. I'm not sure exactly when it's coming out, but they were out. The first season came out like last August, so I have a feeling season 2 will be coming by the end of the summer. So I have that and some other animation stuff I'm working on that I can't talk about. And I just completed recently a new novella, which actually kind of crept over the territory into novel territory from novella, called Dark Future, which I hope will be out either end of the year, early next year. And well, that's a lot. That's a lot right there.
And we're back. Wow. JM has just so much stuff coming out or has come out recently. It's mind-boggling. And I'm sure there's more on the way. And of course, he's always working on new stuff himself. As I called it at the beginning of the episode, it's the DeMatteis Sans. I don't know if it's going to catch on. Let's hope it does. It's hard to pronounce, but it really is just kind of everything's coming up JM DeMatteis. So, JM, thanks for being on the show again. We'd love to have you on down the line, of course, as more and more of your work comes out and even to promote the new stuff. So, until that time, thank you all out there for listening and for viewing. Remember to visit us on Patreon. You'll get early episodes, including this one was a few days early, and on in terms of the benefits. So Dollar Bin Banter, sorry, Dollar Bin Boosters on Patreon. Thank you for rating, reviewing, and subscribing. and we'll see you next issue.